welcome. You're watching a special broadcast on India Ahead with me, Ridhima Bhatnagar. Now, the India-China face-off we've been discussing for almost weeks now. It is the bloodiest clash that we've seen between the two nations in almost 4 decades. Now, de-escalation talks are still on between the two nations, but what really has changed after the Galwan clash, which resulted in India losing 20 of its brave hearts? What should India's strategy be? To discuss this, I have a very special guest joining me today on this broadcast. We have Dr. Lobsang Sangay, who is Tibet's Prime Minister in exile. Dr. Sangay, it's a pleasure having you on India Ahead and for you to have your inputs to give us on this topic, for us to understand what should the learning lessons for India be from Tibet and what should the way ahead really be. Now, before I get into the nitty-gritties of what the strategy should really be, what can the learning lessons from Tibet be, I want to first begin with your sense of understanding of the current face-off between India and China, because it is very, very similar to what happened to Tibet.
Yes, first I want to say hello to you and to all the listeners. And it's a tragedy that 20 brave Jawans have died or killed, and our condolences go out to their family members. Now, as far as Tibetans are concerned, we've been saying this for the last 60 years, that China came in the name of peace and prosperity for the Tibetan people. Ultimately, almost everything that they promised us were betrayed. And at the end, we lost our nation. And people are suppressed and people are suffering. So whenever you deal with the Chinese government, you must verify, then only trust. So in the case of the recent incident, you can clearly see, the de-escalation talk was on, line of actual control was already demarcated, but having, made all these promises, ultimately it led to violence and death of so many soldiers, so which is really tragic and unfortunate.
Yeah. Dr. Sangay, as you rightly pointed out, that there is a sense of betrayal that, of course, Indian side has now seen, because the talks of de-escalation as per the agreement, it was only India that held on to its agreement barter and said that we will de-escalate. But when the Indian side realized that the Chinese hadn't de-escalated, they went ahead for talks, and that's what led to the clash at the Galwan Valley, which resulted in India losing 20 of its brave hearts. But despite all of that, there is never an acceptance from China's side. There is never an acceptance that there was no de-escalation from China's side. Ironically, there was a counter allegation on India that it was actually India who moved into the Chinese territory, and that's what led into the Galwan clash. Has this been a similar learning or sense of deja vu for you when you saw what happened with Tibet as well?
Yes. For the last 60 years, even today, the Chinese government claim that Tibet was peacefully liberated when approximately 1 million Tibetans died after the occupation of Tibet. Right? Even today, they say that Tibetans are happy and content, and so they follow the Chinese leadership, when in fact 154 Tibetans have committed self-immolation. Right? Now, they always say this nowadays, the coronavirus is not theirs, but Ladakh is theirs, Tibet is theirs, Taiwan is theirs, Hong Kong is theirs, Arunachal is theirs. All these things are theirs, but except for coronavirus, and we whole world know that coronavirus is theirs. So in broad daylight, they are capable of saying such things. So this is, what happened at the border. It's a symptomatic of the larger picture.
Yeah. Dr. Sangay, before I get to what really is making China so jittery and what's happening with India's other neighbors, I want to understand from you in a very broad perspective, once we've seen this betrayal in terms of de-escalation from China, do you think then Tibet becomes a very, very important component to the resolution in the broader picture?
Yes, because if you look at the map of China, the Han Chinese occupied territory was only 40%. In fact, they built great walls to prevent barbarians and enemies from entering, and that was their wall. Now they have gone beyond the Great Wall and occupied Mongolia, Manchuria, Xinjiang, Tibet, right? So if you look at the map of China, 60% of the territory was occupied militarily, Now, after occupying Tibet, there's a Tibet is the palm. They have to go after five fingers. Ladakh, Arunachal, Sikkim, Bhutan, and Nepal are the five fingers, right? So this has been their strategy, and we've been saying this. What happened to us could happen to you. Now it's happening in India. So historically, it was a demilitarized zone. It was a zone of peace and demilitarized border. It was a peaceful border.
Yeah.
Since India-Tibet border, changed to China-India border, even the media calls it India-China border nowadays, it still remains an India-Tibet border, right? Since then, all this tension have happened and will continue to happen till you address the issue of Tibet, to make Tibet a zone of peace, to restore the status of Tibet as the buffer zone between China and Tibet, China and India.
Yeah, Dr. Sangye, I'll get to that as well. But I just want to, take on from something that you said earlier. Do you think China is already in a very jittery and nervous position, because you already have the pandemic that started from Wuhan, which was the epicenter, and then moved on to various other countries. So there's already a lot of pressure on China for probably first not letting the global community know in time, then not revealing the correct numbers. And even today, probably the recurrence that we've seen, the second wave that we've seen, we're probably not getting the true numbers out of it. So already China was in a vulnerable position, and that is why probably you're seeing a sense of agitation in China today?
Yes. On the one hand, China has a long-term strategy, expansionist policy, occupy Tibet and come out of five fingers. On the other hand, externally, China is facing tremendous pressure. WHO, which normally leans towards China, some of the officials have decided to investigate the origin of the virus, and 130 countries have decided to do it, and objective analysis will be done. And in fact, there could be a punishment, right? Now, at a larger scale, globally, the coronavirus pandemic has caused enormous economic pain, enormous social pain, and health, crisis all over the world. And who is to be blamed? Because China tried to hide the information for 3 to 6 weeks, which cost the global, the whole world, a huge price. Had they told us ahead of time, some experts say 95% of the infection and death could be prevented, right? And internally now there are criticism against Chinese leadership because lack of freedom of speech, lack of democracy, lack of human rights. Now, there you can clearly see in Tibet, nowadays, just recently, they introduced a regulation saying that a monk to move away out of the monastery, you need a permission. From one district to another, you need permission. From one state to another, you need permission. So there's a complete clampdown on Tibetans and Uyghurs and others. What it shows that there's a paranoia within.
And ironically, this is the holy month which allows the movement of monks as well. But you're still seeing the sort of pressure that you're seeing from China.
That's true. It's the holiest month. This is the month when pilgrims were supposed to go for pilgrimages, and people are supposed to visit monasteries and do all kinds of prayers. Now, monks are supposed to go out and pray for the well-being of sentient beings, and Tibet in particular. All these things are restricted. If you are Communist Party members, once you retire, you are banned from going to any monastery or practice any spiritual matters. Can you imagine? You are banned for life. So this, how much of insecurity, paranoia is there. So there's complete clampdown. Hence, 154 Tibetans have committed self-immolation, burned themselves, protesting against the Chinese government.
Yeah. Dr. Sangye, I want to now talk about something that you touched upon earlier, which is the expansionist policies from China that we seem to be on a rise now. Take example of Nepal. You already had Nepal putting out a new map. There are anti-India songs that are being played in Nepal, and it is said that the whole subcontinent has been on the radar of the Chinese leaders since almost 1960s. Do you think this desire of the expansionist policy is on a much heavy, rising than it was even before?
Yes, that's what we've been saying. You have to study Tibet to understand China's mindset, right? And India can learn a lesson. For example, one road was built connecting China to Tibet to bring prosperity, but it brought tanks, guns, and trucks. Now, Tibet was occupied. Now, that one road has become 100 roads. And some of the roads are connecting all the way to the border of India, Arunachal, and Nepal, and Bhutan too, right? Now, the railway line is coming all the way from China to Tibet, to the border of Nepal, and they want to connect it all the way to Lumbini. That's the border of Uttar Pradesh, you know. And 30 airports are there in Tibet, of which 6 are military airfields and bordering, you know, India and Nepal as well. So all this military buildup that took place in Tibet continues to take place, will connect to all the border areas of India, including Bhutan, Nepal, Arunachal Pradesh, and Ladakh. So this is what's happening. So Nepal is under tremendous pressure. So there are more Chinese in Nepal than Tibetans in Nepal now. So this is the equation now. So because of Chinese pressure, Tibetans are also a bit of under stress.
Yeah, so clearly we can see the expansionist plans in terms of China trying to accomplish its 5-finger plan. But I want to, in specific, Dr. Sangay, understand it from you, since you've understood not only just the situation of Tibet, but you understand this mindset of China as well a lot better than many of us do understand. But what is your understanding on what's happening on the line of actual control? Because for India, for the longest time, the LOC has been, the priority in terms of Pakistan. Somewhat sometimes the LAC takes a backseat, but today that is again once again become headlines. What is your understanding of what's really happening on LAC despite all these talks of de-escalation that is still happening at the diplomatic level as well as the military level between both the nations?
I think we should remember late, George Fernandez ji, late John Fernandez, who when he was the defense minister, he said, look, it's not LOC, it's LAC is the challenge. And China is #1 adversary of India. He said that on the record. At that time, he was criticized a lot. Now, all the facts prove that he was right? Now, that at individual level, even in the US and Europe, the discourse went on. Should we cooperate with China or compete with China? After 30 years, there's a consensus in Washington, D.C. China is a competition and less of a cooperation. And Europe recently has decided that China is a competition, less of a cooperator. So India has to go through the same thing, right? Should we compete more or should we cooperate more, right? And LOC and LAC, same thing. As I said, this will continue. Pressure in Nepal, pressure in Ladakh, and Galwan Valley is the same valley through which the Chinese army entered in 1962. Now, two things are very important. This year marks the 70th anniversary of diplomatic relationship between China and India, right? And in Tamil Nadu, when Prime Minister Modi ji met with Xi Jinping in October, they said, we will celebrate this year in a grand way. We will have 70 events to mark 70th anniversary. Essentially, 70 years ago, China let go Taiwan and recognized China, right? And then, India helped China become the member of the UN Security Council. Instead of celebration, incursions and violence and tragedy has happened. So on the one hand, they were extending the hand of friendship. That's the talk. But on the other hand, they were preparing for the intrusion in Galwan Valley.
Yeah, that's something I've spoken to a lot of experts about, exactly what you're saying, Dr. Sangay, that the timing as well was very, very notorious on the part of China. But now I want to understand what can India do from here on. A lot of, you had the foreign counterparts step in and give their commentary as well. You've obviously had Donald Trump saying that we would want to help both the nations, something that he's done in the past as well. Both the nations maintaining that they would like to solve this bilaterally. You had a comment coming in from the United Kingdom, Boris Johnson, as well. Do you think it's the right time for India to probably see some sort of, refuge with the United States, because that's going to play a larger role tomorrow when these bilateral ties between India and China are rebooted?
Yes, practically and ideologically. Practically, India is going to be the chairman of the World Health Organization, and that's when the investigation of the Wuhan virus is going to take place, right? So India has a say as how to shape the investigation of the Wuhan virus. Obviously, it originated in China, and China should be blamed for it, right? And ideologically, you must form an alliance of democracies, right? America is democracy, European countries are democracy, UK, Japan, Australia. This is a challenge of ideology, authoritarian system or democratic system. right? And it's a Xi Jinping thought, or human rights as a basic freedom. This is the challenge, right? Ideologically, India should be on the right side, or the India's path, that is democracy. I mean, everybody accepts that India is the largest, democracy in the whole world, and India should not only participate, should take a lead in saying democracy is what we support, and democracy should be there in China as well, and international norms and regulations should be followed by everybody, including China. That's how you push back. There has to be coordination among like-minded countries.
Yeah, Dr. Sangate, I want to understand from where, taking on from what you said, I want to understand this in two parts. One, I want to understand, there's this huge clamor that's going on in India talking about a whole boycott of the Chinese goods. You've had domestic makers now saying that this is probably an opportune time. We should hurt China economically more than what we can do on the military levels. That's one part of my question, that do you really think that's the way forward in terms of hurting it economically, or not in terms of a knee-jerk reaction, but in terms of a longer perspective? My other part of the question is, what is realistically possible on the issue of Tibet as well? Because the justification that has come from China time and again is a sense of economic justification, which is similar to what we hear for India as well.
Now, as far as boycott is concerned, there's a lot of talk is going on. Now, first of all, instead of boycotting something, you can buy more of Indian goods, Indian manufactured, products, because of the coronavirus, economy of India is affected severely. 100 million migrant workers are unemployed now. Agriculture, everything is affected, right? And this is the time, to buy India's product and supply India's, goods. This is a logical thing to do. You don't have to boycott something. You buy more of India. And Make in India campaign by, Nehru, Modi ji should be supported by all the Indian companies, right? And most importantly, I've been saying this, celebrities should endorse India's product. Then the Indian people will buy more. And at this time, when there's tremendous pressure on employment and economy, if celebrities keep endorsing Chinese products, then the fans and the followers will be led to buy more of the product, right? So there are a lot of things you can do within India. And number two, issue of Tibet. Yes, India should recognize that Tibet is very important. Geopolitically, we are talking, right? Historically, culturally, spiritually, very connected. And hence, we need to educate the Indian masses about Tibet. Now, Galwan Valley incident happened. Certainly, there's interest on Tibet. But at the university level, how many departments are there on Tibetan studies program? At think tanks, how many Tibetan researchers there, right? But if you go to Harvard or Yale or Cornell, any major universities in America or Europe, there are so many Tibetan studies program, and there are so many Tibetan who are experts on this field, right? So if you want to really, address this issue, you need to educate Indian people, at least intellectuals, the think tanks, universities, about Tibet, and bring Tibet as the core issue. When China says, let's solve this border issue, India should say, let's do it. And Tibet should be the zone of peace. Tibet should be the buffer zone. Tibetan people deserve their basic human rights because largest number of Tibetans are in India. And for all these historical, cultural, spiritual reasons, we need to support the people of Tibet.
Interesting you say that, Dr. Sangate. So, diplomatically, if I had to ask you, what can be the learning for India? Because diplomatic talks are still on. Can India really learn from what Tibet went through? Because if you look at the Shimla Convention of 1914, the terms of the border of Tibet finds mention in it. But after it was renewed between Beijing and India, India actually had to withdraw some of its personnel, and that later resulted in the war of 1962. So that really didn't play well for India as well. So do you think those are lessons from what happened with Tibet and India earlier as well, for India to now pay deeper attention of the lessons it can now learn from both these parties?
Yes, I think from 1914 on, with a similar convention of 1914 between India and Tibet, the Chinese objection was border between Tibet and China. They didn't object the border demarcation between India and Tibet, right? Essentially, they accepted it, but ultimately, they didn't sign the document, mainly because they disagreed with the border between Tibet and China, right? But and then it was supposed to renewed every 10 years, so 24, 34, 44, it was renewed between Tibet and India. But in 54, Indian government decided to renew it with China, and then they came back with Panchshil. So if you look at the body of the document, it's all trade. But if you look at the preamble, they put 5 points and say Panchshil. But in the document itself, the betrayal is there. Because the Panchshil was supposed to last for 25 years as per India's wishes, but China wanted it to last for 5 years, and later they negotiated it supposed to last for 8 years. In 5 years, 54 plus 5, in 1959, Tibet was occupied, and 54 plus 8 years, 1962, invasion of India happened, right? So the Panchshil, the document for trade and tranquility, was essentially, treachery and tragedy. And the tension prevails even now. So you can learn a lot of lessons even with these documents.
Okay. Dr. Sangye, before I wrap up, I want to shift a little bit, and I also want to understand, you see a close relationship with the Holiness Dalai Lama himself. You have also become, in sort, the official spokesperson for him. Have you had a chance to talk to him about the situation and any sort of reaction that has come from Dalai Lama himself?
His Holiness is in complete retreat now, given the pandemic, and he's isolated. So normally I get to, get audience with His Holiness almost every month, sometimes few times a month as well. So because I'm more exposed to the public, so there's, bigger chances of me being infected. So I have not sought any audience, but he has been in the public. At least online, giving spiritual teachings and all that. So he's doing very, very well. He calls himself a proud son of India. He talks about India everywhere in the whole world. So he loves, he loves India. He loves Indian tradition, Nalanda tradition, secularism, all that. So you have the best person as far as India is concerned. So obviously he's very sympathetic to what's happening with India. But, now I'm given the political responsibilities since 2011. We have complete separation of church and state. So I'm doing my part because this is a political matter. So I'm doing the best I can to represent the views of the Tibetan people as a whole.
Okay. Dr. Sangye, lastly, before I let you go, so now that we've understood the lessons that probably India can see from Tibet, and understanding the mindset of China is extremely important right now, what should be the way ahead for India now?
Yes, and there must be de-escalation at the border, and there must be talk to solve this. But also should learn that incursions have increased from 2012 till now, from 200 to 300 to 400. And the standoff from Doklam in 2017 to standoff in Ladakh, it's several incursions. And the violence that took place, should learn that, it might continue, not just continue, it might escalate. So be very prepared, be very cautious, and verify, then only trust.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's a very, very important set of information and a message that you're sending out, Dr. Sangye, which is verify, understand the mindset, and take lessons from Tibet as well. It's been a pleasure chatting with you, Dr. Sangye. Thank you so much for taking our time and talking to us here at India Ahead. Slipping into a very short break. News and updates continue on the other side.